Hello everybody, Orin here, and today I'm going to talk to you about beyond the MCSE, what's going on with Windows Server certification. So certification has always been important to Windows Server IT professionals. In fact, Microsoft's first certification exam was related to the predecessor to Windows Server, which was Windows NT. And the first exam was Windows NT and Foundational Technologies, which was released way back in 1992. So that's 33 years ago. And there's still people in the industry who started off with that exam. The first MCSE, which came through with a combination of exams, was actually awarded in 1993. And that was on Windows NT 3.51. Since then, there were MCSEs on Windows NT 4, Windows 2000, Windows Server 2003. After that, things changed a little, and we actually had a slightly different certification. But in that 2000 and 2003 timeframe, we also had the MCSA on Windows 2000 and the MCSA on Windows Server 2003. It was a sort of shorter certification that didn't require as many exams. Between sort of 2008 and 2008 R2, in that time frame, we switched across to the MCITP, the Microsoft Certified IT Professional. Now, that particular certification didn't have the recognition of the MCSE, and at the time, Microsoft was thinking, oh, well, maybe we need to get away from that. But a lot of people said, look, we actually prefer the Microsoft Certified Systems Expert. So in 2012, we went back to the MCSE, and in 2016, we had an MCSE. Now, after 2016, sometime around 2018 or 2019, we retired the certification. And a lot of you would be sitting there going, well, what happened was that Microsoft retired all of its on-premises certifications, and the only certifications that you could get were cloud-based. And that was true for a couple of years. Around 2020, we started looking at introducing a new Windows Server certification. And what we wanted to do was get something that was a bit different to what we'd done in the past. Those of you that had done the MCSE knew that we'd broken it up into what was functionally an operating system exam, a networking exam, an Active Directory exam. And there was various combinations of that over the year. What we saw when we were looking at certification again this time is how could we actually tell the real story of how people were using Windows Server in their environment. And that wasn't that they were using it entirely in the cloud, and that most people weren't entirely on-prem as well, that there was somewhere in between. And that's how we came up with the Windows Server Hybrid Admin Associate, which really deals with Windows Server from on-prem workloads and how you configure things that are on-prem. And I'll talk a little more about how the exam works a little later, right through to how it integrates and runs in Azure or in some sort of Azure Arc hybrid configuration. Anyway, certification has always been very important for IT professionals. Developers tend to be a bit more, let me just show you the code that I've written, and then you can assess my ability there. But when you're looking at a server administrator, a certification, and I'll come to the reasons why you might consider one, has always been much more of a marker of where you are in your career or that you have a set of expertise. And in today's job market, in fact, in any job market, because it's always challenging, being able to not only say, hey, I worked on that technology when I was in that particular role, but having an external signifier about it is actually a very good thing when you're a job seeker looking for a new role. And even if you're secure in your current role, we know that job security these days is always not nearly as much as it might have been in the days of our parents. So in 2025, let's talk about the current Windows Server credentials and certifications. And I've used the word credentials there quite deliberately. Now, we have the certification, which is the Windows Server Hybrid Admin Associate. And I'm going to talk about these in more depth a little later. But the Windows Server Hybrid Admin Associate requires that you take 2 exams. Most certifications these days only require you to take 1 exam. Although if you think back to the days of the NT MCSE, that actually took you 6 exams to get. So asking for you to take 2 exams doesn't seem nearly as challenging as it was when I got my first MCSE on Windows NT 4. Now, with the Windows Server Hybrid Admin Associate, you take each of these exams, and they can be a couple of hours, and you take them at a testing centre, or you take them as a proctored online test. You might not be aware of it, but it's actually possible now to take your certification exams at home. But there's a bunch of conditions about it. When you actually do it, what happens is that you have to take it in a room that you're specially prepared. You have to basically have someone supervise you and watch you through your webcam while you're doing it. And recently we changed how you would do exams with open book. Now, what that actually means is that when you're in the exam testing environment, you're actually able to access Microsoft Learn content in a split view when you're performing your exam. Now, you can't go and browse external websites. You certainly can't go and ask an LLM how to answer a question for you, but you can use the Microsoft documentation resources in the exam. So it's somewhat open book, but it only is going to be useful for you if you've actually studied. If you went in cold and you didn't know anything about Windows Server, it wouldn't matter how good you were at looking through learn.microsoft.com, you probably weren't going to pass the exam. The other thing about the Windows Server Hybrid Admin Associate is that once you get it, every year you take a free online test to renew your certification. And that simply allows Microsoft to add in whatever new technologies have come along. Now, of course, with Windows Server and the hybrid technologies, most of the time the technology moves fairly slowly. Now, we are just in the process of updating the current Windows Server Hybrid Admin Associate exams, and I'll talk about the 2 exams from Windows Server 2022 to Windows Server 2025. So in the newer version of the exam, and you can see it on the exam objectives when they're updated, we might have some topics that are specifically about Windows Server 2025. So looking at Windows Server Summit is a really good bit of preparation for your Windows Server hybrid exams, because you'll learn about all of the new technologies or all of the new developments in Windows Server. The next thing to understand is that we've got a new type of credential. That's called an applied skill credential. Now, unlike a traditional exam where you pay a fee to the exam provider and then you sit down and take several-hour exam, and it's essentially multiple choice with some builder list and other types of questions, but it's really you're reading a scenario and then you're answering a question about the scenario. What happens in an applied skill credential is you are given essentially a briefing document, and you've got to interpret that briefing document and then implement what you've got to do to address the problems in the briefing document in a practical environment. And related to Windows Server, we now have the Active Directory Applied Skill Credential. And what the Active Directory Applied Skill Credential is it's a free, practical task-based assessment where you're asked to perform a set of tasks in a limited amount of time related to Active Directory. And because this is specifically on-prem Active Directory focused, all of the tasks will be related to the management of on-premises Active Directory. Now, if you're sitting there going, well, that doesn't sound very hybrid, almost every organization in the world that's using Entra is probably syncing their identity from an on-prem Active Directory instance. And what we found is that there's a lot of new people coming into the industry that might have Entra skills, but might not have actually Active Directory skills. And you've generally got to have both if you're going to be a successful Windows Server administrator. Now, with this free exam, you can actually take it if you fail it every 72 hours. And you've essentially got unlimited retries. Of course, it does cost you an hour of your life. So it's open book. You can look at any resources that you want to look at, but it's really about your ability to interpret what the problem statement is and what it's asking you, and then to figure out, oh, actually, that means I need to go and perform this particular task in this environment. It might be moving a FSMO role. It might be creating a delegated managed service account. It might be promoting a domain controller. It might be turning on Active Directory recycle bin. Just essentially proving that you understand and that you know how to manage Active Directory. That's what that applied skill is. And even if you're a experienced administrator, and I'll talk about this in a moment, it's not a bad credential to get because it gives you an idea of how Microsoft is now doing credentialing as well. Because we've not only got the Active Directory applied skill, we've got a whole bunch of other applied skills. But the Active Directory one is the most relevant to Windows Server IT professionals. Okay, so let's answer the challenging question. Why on earth would you get a credential or a certification in 2025? When I started out back in the 1990s, certification was really coming into its own. And that when you were applying for a job, especially if you're trying to do what I was doing with my second job, which I'd gone from help desk and I'd started doing server administration work to going out into a pure server administration role, it really helped me burnish on my resume what my skills were. If you're new in career, that is that you're early on in your career and you're still climbing up that ladder to a permanent systems administration type role, what a certification and an applied skill credential does is it provides an external signifier of your understanding and your willingness to perform self-driven professional development. I can't tell you how important it is when you're looking at a candidate to look between the candidate who just says, oh yeah, look, I can learn it on the fly, I've done it in this role and I'm really good, to someone who not only wants to do that when they're in their job role, but someone who's also looking for external validation. Every bit of external validation helps because the people who are assessing your application for a new job or your application for a promotion might not be conversant with the technology, but they can look at a vendor certification and they can go, you know what, the vendor seems to believe this person understands this topic, at least to the ability of passing a certification. And just because you pass a certification doesn't mean you have expertise, but what it does mean is that you've taken the effort to go and get the certification or the applied skill. Think about that Active Directory applied skill. It's free. Now, if you're looking at two candidates, one who says I studied Active Directory in college and the other who says I studied Active Directory in college and I went out and got this free applied skill that says I can do Active Directory related tasks, which one is going to be bumped to the top of your list? Now, the other thing about a credential or a certification is it does go beyond the material covered by academic institutions. There's a lot of people who come out of vocational courses where they're learning systems administration, but they're learning what has been decided by the person who designed that curriculum, and that might be extensive or it might not be. It gives you another signifier of competence. So let's think about the rest of you, those of you who are established in your career. If you've been a systems administrator for 20, 25 years, why on earth would you go and get a credential? Why on earth would you go and get a certification? Because there is no point in the job at which you have to stop learning. And if there's no point in the job at which you have to stop learning, you want to have signposts that you are continuing to learn, because you might need to look for a new role abruptly, or you might be planning to look at a new role. And if you look at someone's resume and you're seeing that every so often they're going back and they're getting a certification, they're taking a test, they're renewing their skills, they're growing their skills, that's a candidate, again, that you're going to be bumping up your list of preferred candidates, because it's showing that that candidate's got a willingness to go and learn. Whereas someone who's just sort of sitting there and has never gone back into a testing centre once they've got their first job, well, they might be great at learning, but it's a lot harder to see that from just looking at their resume. Now, certification also provides you with an objective validation of your understanding. Now, what that means is that when you learn a topic, when you're solving a problem, You only generally learn enough to solve the problem. What a certification does, and the way that they test you, is they essentially require a broad understanding of the topic. And it means that you'll learn things about the topic that you might not need in your immediate day-to-day work, but sometimes can become useful later on. I learned a lot about Windows Server very early in my career that I never used, that became insanely useful later on. I mean, of course, now I help design the certifications and I write books about the topic, but having that breadth of understanding that a certification brings is never going to hurt you in your career. Now, the main one I want to keep coming back to is that when you're thinking about your career, you should be thinking of ways to put signposts into your career just beyond where you've worked that externally validate that you are continuing to develop as a professional. Every year you should know more than you knew the year before. You don't get to some magical stage or magical age in your career where you get to stop learning. And certification is just another path to you growing your skills and validating your skills. So let's talk about the first Active Directory applied skill credential. The skills tested are deploy and manage Active Directory domain controllers, configure Active Directory topology, things like replication, create and manage Active Directory objects. That could be user accounts, group accounts, or service accounts. Create and configure group policy objects, and manage security in Active Directory. So it's an hour-long test, and you might be asked to do some or all of those tasks in an hour, and you just go through and do it. I've talked to people who have taken it, who it took 25 minutes to do, and people who it took 55 minutes to do. There's a URL on the slide here for aka.ms ADDS applied skill test. If you go there, you'll see all the information you need to do, and you'll be able to launch the test from there. So who should take this applied skill credential? If you want to validate that you've got Active Directory understanding, this is a great thing to do. In fact, I've talked to people who are in the process of employing people in their organization, and they use applied skills tests as ways of validating whether or not someone actually has the knowledge that they're claiming on their resume. It's also relevant for those people who support on-premises AD where it syncs up to Entra, because you've still got to know how to do those basic administrative tasks for all of those on-premises security credentials. So you might want to take it. You might want to take it to see how useful a test it is of Active Directory, and then maybe use it when you're doing recruiting of your own. The next thing to talk about is the full-fledged certification. And the fully fledged certifications is the Windows Server Hybrid Admin Associate. So this requires you take 2 exams, and each exam is a couple of hours long and is about 50 or more or less, depending on how you go, questions and what turns up on the day. But it's about you answering questions. And as I mentioned earlier, it's also about your ability to answer questions and solve problems, but much more textually than you would get in the Active Directory applied skill. So remember that this one is somewhat open book. You're able to access learn.microsoft.com within the testing environment, but that you have to take it as a test and you have to pay for the test. So each exam is broken up into 5 major areas, and you'll get questions in each of these areas. If you do a search on learn.microsoft.com, you can see all of the items that might be tested on the exam. And the reality is you'll only get a fraction of these items. When it comes down to the number of items, there's actually a couple of hundred, but if you're only getting 50 items in a test, you're obviously not getting tested on all of them. So the first one is deploy and manage Active Directory domain services on premises and in cloud environments. So you need to know about how you run AD on-prem, AD in hybrid, and AD if you're running it in Azure. How to manage Windows Server and workloads in hybrid environment. What are the management tools? So you've got to understand how your PowerShell works, how your Windows Admin Center works, how all of your consoles work. Managing virtual machines and containers, that's all about how you manage virtualization. Hyper-V replica, Hyper-V failover clusters, how you configure virtual machines, how do you configure dynamic memory, how do you configure virtual machine storage. All of that's covered under that particular area. And then implement and manage on-premises hybrid networking infrastructure. So that's things as basic as DNS and DHCP, but also how do you connect to Azure VPNs or ExpressRoute. Then we've got managed storage and file services. This isn't just managing file servers. How do you manage storage spaces? How do you manage storage replica? How do you manage all elements of storage that are running on Windows Server? How do you manage SAN connections? All of that would fit under that particular area. So you can see that AZ800 is very much those core areas of Windows Server knowledge, and it is primarily on premises, but there's a little bit of cloud in that one. Then we move into the Advanced Services exam, AZ801. Now, AZ801 is different because in AZ801, you get a lot more of the advanced hybrid topics. So we start with the security domain, and the security domain is all about securing Windows Server. So all of the tools that you can use to secure Windows Server, from basic stuff like Windows Firewall, or applying particular group policies to lock down passwords and so on, right through to the Defender stuff and how Defender works and how you can do application control of Windows Server. So the whole spectrum of securing Windows Server. In the old days, there used to be an entire Windows Server securing exam. Well, right now, it's all sitting in that particular objective of this particular exam. Implement and manage Windows Server high availability. So that is failover clustering, but it's also how do you implement high availability in the cloud if you've got Windows Server deployed in the cloud? Or how do you configure failover so that you can fail over to the cloud? And then we've got implementing disaster recovery. So how do you do disaster recovery on premises? How do you do disaster recovery in hybrid environments? How do you do disaster recovery in the cloud? It means understanding how Azure Backup works and how you can integrate Azure Backups with VMs running in the cloud. Also, how does Windows Server Backup work? What do you need to back up, or what gets backed up when you back up the system state? Then we've got migrating servers and workloads. And that isn't just, let's talk about migrating to the cloud. It's also, how do we migrate from an old version of Windows Server to a new version? How do you move your forest from an old forest to a new forest? Let's say that you've got to do a forest migration, or that one company buys out another and you've got to bring in all of their servers and services into your new environment. And then finally, we've got the domain monitor and troubleshoot Windows Server environments. In that one, it's all about how do you do monitoring, and then how do you troubleshoot common problems. We've got a session at Windows Server Summit about the most common problems that turn up in people's environment. Well, this is really about how do you troubleshoot problems. If you saw a particular problem, what do you do? Do you go back to last night in good configuration? What's likely to be the problem if you see this sort of thing? This isn't obscure stuff. It's common troubleshooting stuff that, if you think about your role as an IT professional, you're always doing every day anyway. Anyway, the first takeaway I want you to take away from this particular session is that you can go out right now and take the Active Directory Applied Skills credential and get yourself a brand new credential for free by performing a practical set of exercises in a simulated environment. The other is to remember that certification is still relevant to you wherever you are in your career as an IT professional. It's relevant to you at the start of your career, and it's a great way of demonstrating that you've got a continued commitment to developing your career when you're in the mid to late career stage. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention. I hope if you've got any questions, you've asked them in the chat. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to me using the contact details on this slide. Thank you very much for your attention, and have a wonderful day.